The world is a little bit scary outside right now, so I wanted to go through my bookshelves and look at books that you could easily read in a week or just in a day if at any point you need to self-isolate. These books happen to be 7 of my favourite classics, and they're all books that you can probably find online because I think they're out of copyright, so if you need to stay in, I've got you covered. With all of these books, I've tried to pick books that are under 300 pages, most of them actually under 200 pages, because for me, I am a slow reader, so I think if I was going to read a book in a day, it would probably have to be under the 200 page mark. But I pretty much love all of these books, and I'm going to start with the author that I know you will know I'm going to mention, and that is Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf wrote a lot of short books. Thank you, Virginia. It's almost like she knew. The 2 I would recommend most are Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse. They are both my favourite Woolf novels if I have to pick them. I always say Mrs. Dalloway is probably my first love because it was the first one I read, but To the Lighthouse I think is one of the best books ever written in English. Same goes for Mrs. Dalloway, to be honest. People are often afraid of Virginia Woolf. People are often scared of her because her writing can seem a little bit hard to get into. I think there's a lot of snobbery around Virginia Woolf as well. Mrs. Dalloway is a beautiful novel about a woman who is planning a party, and as you are reading the novel, her entire life and the other people in her life and people she's had connections with and her past all unravel together, and it is a wonderful novel. It's a novel in one day, so out of all of these books, if you were going to read one book in a day, Mrs. Dalloway would be the way to go, because you could read it along almost the time that Mrs. Dalloway is going about her day in London. To the Lighthouse is about the Ramsay family and whether or not they will go to the lighthouse. The same with Mrs. Dalloway. I read The Lighthouse as a part of my undergrad dissertation. That's what I did my dissertation on. And I was looking at spaces and domestic spaces and the placement of women in particular. And the novel is fascinating because you have this group of people who are desperate to leave this small domestic space to go out to the lighthouse to seek other things outside of that domestic sphere. In particular, you have an artist who is looking for what her life means as a woman and what her art means and how she expresses herself. The same way you have Mrs. Ramsay also identifying her life now after having children and looking over her relationship with her husband. To the Lighthouse and Mrs. Dalloway are always the novels I return to and have read multiple times. If you've meant to read Virginia Woolf, this is where I would start. The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I've only read The Great Gatsby. I haven't read any other of F. Scott Fitzgerald's work, which I really need to do because I love this novel so much. I love this novel because it is basically about the failings of capitalism and the failings of American dream, and you really see these characters' lives disintegrate before your eyes. As we are now back in the 20s, I feel like 2020 is a year to read The Great Gatsby again, but as we are in the capitalist society we are in, I think we often need to remind ourselves of the lessons that are in The Great Gatsby. The images and the metaphors that are in The Great Gatsby with the green light, everybody knows about. People who've not even read the novel know. So when you read this novel, you feel like you can suddenly understand a different language that maybe other people have been talking about. And that's a really beautiful feeling. It's also just one of the most amazing, beautiful books I've ever read, and you want to say the passages out loud because it is so well written. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is one of my favourite books of all time. I love this book. I've still got a couple of my notes in from university. I studied this on, I think, in my Gothic and horror seminar, and I completely loved it. It's a 19th century piece of writing and it's set in Victorian London. I remember the essay I did on this because I think it was my first ever first, and it was on looking at the architecture of London and how it was symbolic of the psychology of the characters. If you like Victorian writing and if you like books that are about place and setting and architecture of cities and urban landscapes, this is phenomenal. I just think it's one of the best books ever written, and it's absolutely tiny. I think this is probably the shortest one we have here in this little collection. Oh yeah, because it's 2 stories, The Bottle Imp, in this book as well, which I've never read. So maybe I will read that now. So the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is 73 pages. amazing. I'm now realising quite a lot of these books I studied at university in my undergrad, especially in like my first or second year, probably because they are shorter. And this book I studied in one of my American seminars, and that is The Awakening by Kate Chopin. It is about the confines of being in a gilded cage. It's about the domestic sphere. It's about being a woman in the 19th century in America. I really want to reread this because, again, it's been a long time since I've been at university. I always talk about university as if it was just last year ago, but we're now talking about 5-6 years ago. Ian Forster is one of my favourite all-time writers. My favourite novel of his so far, I haven't read all of his work, but I will one day, is Howard's End. And I would love to include Howard's End because I do think it's a novel that everybody should read. But it is just over my page limit, and a room review just makes it. So does Angels Fear to Tread, but I don't like that novel as much. So a room review is the way to go. Ian Forster's characterisation is, I think, one of the best in English literature. In my mind, he's kind of up there with like Dickens. Very different characterisation, but you really love all of the characters, even though the characters you're not supposed to really like. They are kind of almost wonderful caricatures of themselves. A Room Review is a wonderful story of coming of age, really. It's a love story, but it's as much a love letter to Italy as it is within the characters themselves. All of Ian Forster's novels deal with class, and this is no exception. And I love how you see these different characters navigate between the classes, and how Ian Forster kind of highlights different classes at different points of the novel. A lot of the actual action in this novel deals where characters trespass class, or when a different class suddenly comes into view and actually impacts the lives of the other characters. I don't know if that quite makes sense, but Ian Forster deals with class really, really interestingly. You also just feel like you're there, you feel like you're walking around Italy. On the back of this novel it says it's a sunny tale of love and liberation. It 100% is, and it really does feel like a perfect novel to read in spring as well. I've almost got two options for the last book, and one of them I would choose, and the other one I think Ben would choose. We've kind of been talking about it, but my pick for the last book in this collection is Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, because it is the shortest adult Jane Austen novel. I wanted to pick this one because I've actually had a complex relationship with Northanger Abbey. When I first read it, I really didn't care for it. I read it, I think it was the first classic I ever read. Then I read it in my undergrad and was kind of like, yeah, I enjoy it now, it's good. And then I read it in my MA and really enjoyed it and got a lot from it. So I wanted to pick this because I think it's a sign that rereading books is often really important, especially books that you kind of don't really like. It's absolutely fine to continue not liking a book. I've done that before. I'm not saying that you should reread a book because eventually you'll like it, as if like you've missed out something really important and at first you weren't clever enough to know why you didn't like it. But this is a novel I came to appreciate the more times that I read it. The novel is about Catherine Morland, who is very much like me in a lot of ways. I often say I'm like a mixture of Catherine Morland, Emma and Marianne. I know that's like 3 whole novels, but I do really love her as a character, and it's about her naivety, and it's a good old Jane Austen coming of age story with the best hero I think in all of Jane Austen literature, Mr. Tilney. With Northanger Abbey, in the same way that I also like kind of Mansfield Park, I also feel like Jane Austen is kind of challenging the patriarchy in this one a little bit, with Mr. Tilney's mother having died and the view that maybe she's been murdered, and she really unsettles something there, like by parodying and, you know, making a satire of the Gothic genre, which Jane Austen, you know, was reading before she was writing and was really, really popular in the 18th century. She also actually brings up some real questions about women and dead women in the society that she was, you know, living and writing in. The reason I picked another novel is because this is actually over the limit. This is near 300 pages, and I was trying so hard to get novels that were shorter, but I wanted to include a Jane Austen because I do think they're easy to read, and this is also a small edition, so I have read books that are definitely not as long as this one says Northanger Abbey is. I also picked Frankenstein by Mary Shelley for a couple of reasons. So I read this, I think, when I was in my GCSEs. I'm pretty certain I did one of my GCSEs on this novel. I can't can't remember. Yeah, I think it was Frankenstein. Now that really feels like a long time ago. And I'm pretty certain I read it again in my undergrad. I now can't remember doing that. I think I almost certainly did reread that. I'll have to ask Ben, he might remember. So I just don't think I gave Frankenstein enough of an effort, and actually I think I would really enjoy it. So I am desperate to reread this. I might actually call Ben in to see if he will do a cameo. Ben, do you want to come in and say why you like Frankenstein? Did we do this at university as well?
We did both of them.
Yes, we did not think of, and we did Frankenstein?
I did Frankenstein.
In when? In what?
First year, I think.
I think I was also supposed to read Frankenstein, and I probably did.
Mm-hmm.
I vaguely remember. I've never not read a book for university.
I think Claire forgot to read a book for university.
I didn't.
I think someone didn't read a book for university. The monster is probably one of the most interesting sort of anti-hero protagonists in fiction. And this idea of this sort of ultimate outsider striving for acceptance and being rejected by polite and civilized society, in quotation marks, after the science of that society was what created him in the first place. That sort of idea of, I suppose, that idea of, you know, industrialized capitalist society at that point sweeping the undesirables it's created under the rug. Like, I feel like there's a lot of like parallels with the monster and the way we treat homelessness, for example.
That's why I think I'd enjoy it, because I think it's a very like left-wing, well, as much as like, you know, the 19th century can be. I think a lot of the stuff it discusses, I feel like I would be really interested in. But I think because I was a little bit like, oh, I don't like science fiction, or I don't like books about monsters.
Also, it's just really, really well written. Really, really evocative prose.
Cool. Yeah. Anything else?
It's a good book. Go read.
Okay, cool. You may leave now.
Cool.
You are now banished from...
Like the monster.
Yeah, exactly. It's all a circle. So they are 7 books that I think you could easily read in a week. And 7 classics that I love and find interesting. And a lot of people ask me, like, where do I start with classics? What do I read first? Well, this I think is a great list of my favourite writers and books that I personally also started reading classics with. And so I hope this video has been useful for that. And it's also just been a nice opportunity to sit down and talk about my favourite books with you.